B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, July 27th, 2020. After a weekend of more confrontation on the streets of Portland, Seattle, and some other cities, Trump has announced that dominating the streets of Portland with federal agents has been so successful that he's doubling down. He's sending 100 more federal marshals to Portland, Oregon. And today, I want to bring you an eyewitness report from photojournalist Payton Bruni, who has been on the scene in Portland since early July and was there over the weekend. And before I bring you his report, which I recorded a couple of hours ago, I want to note that some of his stunning photography of the scene there near the federal building in downtown Portland is available online. And there is a link to it. It's the first entry in the show file for today's podcast at peterbcollins.com. So if you're so inclined and, physically and technically able, you can click on the photo collection there from a television station in the Portland area, and you can click through the photos as you listen to this report from Payton Bruni. Payton Bruni joins me. He is a photojournalist, and he just graduated this spring from the University of Oregon in Eugene from the journalism school. He's been on the streets of Portland with his camera capturing incredible images. Payton, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So were you covering these protests? We're now over 60 days of protesting in Portland post the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis. Did you go out early, or did you come when the federales were deployed about 10 days ago?
I was here before the federal officers were deployed. So the first time I went up to cover the Portland protests was for the 4th of July. Mm-hmm. Primarily, I've been focused on covering protests in Eugene, but once things started to get pretty hectic up in Portland, I made my way up there for the 4th of July, and I've been going there since.
And how do you protect yourself? Are you marked with press identifications? And has the ruling by the federal judge aimed at protecting journalists and other legal observers, has that had any positive impact?
Well, first off, as far as the gear that I bring to protect myself, at first I didn't have much. I just had eye protection, and then I realized pretty quick that was a poor decision. I had someone, I don't know who, but someone threw a glass bottle at my head, and it, crashed against the wall, probably a foot behind my head. And so I go over there now, and I have eye protection, military-grade eye protection that protects from shrapnel, a helmet, and a gas mask if the tear gas starts flying. Mm-hmm. So that's been very helpful. I always wear press credentials. I have one hanging from the back of my backpack that has an image of me in very clear press in all caps. I wear a black T-shirt that has giant white press letters printed across the front. Mm-hmm. I have another press credential that I wear hanging from my neck, and then a smaller one with the National Press Photographers Association that I have as well.
Does that protect you, or does it make you a target?
I think it protects me, at least in Portland. The incident with the bottle throwing, that was a one-off. I would say from the roughly 10 times I've been covering Portland protests now, I've only had one incident like that, whereas, I've had 10 or 15 people actually thank me for being up there.
Mm-hmm. All right.
And then on the issue of, did that order actually protect journalists and have the federales been keeping their hands off the press? From what I can see, yes. So last Saturday night I was up there, and I was able to get 3 feet away from federal police officers after they just got done pushing back protesters away from the courthouse. Mm-hmm. And I was taking images, getting right up close in front of them, taking shots to their face, and I didn't have any trouble. And I didn't see any other press have trouble either.
Okay. And so take a minute or two to describe the events over this past weekend that have led President Trump to announce reinforcements. An additional 100 federal officers are being dispatched to Portland.
Yeah, so it's been an interesting week. I would say leading up to last weekend, there weren't a lot. Well, there were significantly fewer people at those protests than there are now. I would say in the ballpark of 500 or 700 each night.
Mm-hmm.
After President Trump made his public statement and then announced that he would be sending troops, now there are consistently over 1,000 people there every night. And this past weekend, there were 3,000 people there.
Mm.
And each night there's a sort of a similar routine in the sense that thousands of people gather near the Justice Center and the courthouse, chanting, protesting, sign holding, the usual peaceful protesting routine. And then people will line up around the fence line that has been erected by police around the courthouse. And then that's usually where things start to devolve. Protesters will, from what I've seen, and I should clarify that it's usually a small group of people who will start to push and pull at the fence, throw fireworks and pieces of trash over the fence as well. And then once the fence starts to be damaged or compromised, that's usually when the federal police or police will announce, hey, we're declaring this a riot. If you continue to try to tear down the fence, we're going to use tear gas. And then protesters do not, a section of the fence will be damaged or torn down, and then the tear gas starts flying.
Mm-hmm. And tear gas is off limits for use by the Portland police under recent legislation from the city council, right?
That is my understanding.
Mm-hmm. But the feds can use it without restraint, and it appears that they do on a nightly basis. Yes,
that is very accurate.
Okay.
First, I saw Portland police officers on the 4th of July, for example, were using, I saw 30 cans of tear gas be fired by, I would say, 1 a.m. Recently, I haven't seen much Portland police presence at all, and I have not seen them fire tear gas in the recent weeks.
One of the issues of contention has been coordination by the Portland cops with the federal contingent. What's your observation about that?
I would say, personally, I'm not clear as to what degree that people are cooperating or not cooperating. And so what is one interesting thing that I have been able to notice that I've seen DHS officers and federal officers primarily stationed inside the courthouse, and then I've seen Portland police officers stationed inside the Justice Center, a separate building. Mm-hmm. And I haven't seen much interaction or cooperation between the two. And there was actually an interesting scenario where when I was standing in front of the courthouse and federal officers started firing tear gas, I had to run away because I got tear gas, so I needed to get away from the smoke, and I was running behind the Justice Center. And a Portland police officer who was standing out there, as I was running by, he asked me, did the feds just use tear gas? And I told him yes. So it was like he didn't know that it was about to be used, and he didn't know that it was currently being used. So that was interesting.
And based on the lack of integration of these law enforcement entities, I imagine their radios are on different frequencies, and so they don't hear the chatter of each other's communications. Is that accurate?
I cannot say for certain because I have no idea of what would be discussed, or I have no way to monitor or even listen into what the radio chatter or how the radio chatter goes on.
All right.
But I do see the federal officers will frequently make adjustments to their radios that they have hanging on their hips or the front of their bodies.
Mm-hmm. Now, I understand that the federal officers keep expanding their footprint. Technically, they are there to protect the Hatfield courthouse, but they appear to kind of expand their perimeter at will. What have you seen in the last few days related to that, Payton?
The last few days, what I have seen is that they have been sticking to the confines of a fence perimeter that they set up around the courthouse and the courthouse alone. I would say 2 weeks ago, police used to set up a fence around the entirety of Chapman Square in front of the courthouse and Justice Center. And since then, they have stopped doing that, and there's just a new and improved fence in front of the courthouse. And then the federal police will stay inside of that fence line until they decide they need to push protesters away from the building, and then they'll exit the fence line.
Payton, I'm going to share with my listeners a link to local television station KVAL, which I think you're contributing to their reporting. And I'm looking at a close-up here of two of the camo-clothed officers, and they're heavily dressed with, of course, goggles, gas mask, helmets, and I see sidearms. And they do sport an ID that says Police U.S. Marshal. Are these identifiers new? Because the images I was seeing as recently as a few days ago showed them without any visible ID on their persons.
I would say I haven't seen consistency in the identifiers that they have been wearing, and their uniforms have been varying as well. I know when police in unmarked vans were snatching people off the street, protesters who were walking by themselves, that they did not have identifiers and they were not identifying themselves. But what I saw last weekend, and as you're able to see in those photos, is now that they have the U.S. Marshal Police Force identifying them somewhere on their uniform.
And do they have individual markers, either a number or a name, so that you could report somebody who crosses the line, for example?
I have not personally seen that, no. I have been trying to watch for that. I've been trying to see if they have a name or a badge number or something of the sort. I personally haven't seen that, but I have noticed that on the Portland police officers, so I thought that was interesting because it has been notably absent from many of the federal officer uniforms that I've seen.
And Payton, there was a federal court ruling against the Attorney General of the state of Oregon, claiming that she didn't have standing to sue over the presence of these troops, and in particular, their failure to identify themselves. What was the reaction to that on the street?
It's hard for me to say because the protests are I wouldn't say disorganized, but there's a lot of different people with a lot of different viewpoints there. And I didn't hear or see anyone who was reacting directly to any of the recent news about the rulings. But I can say that the protests have significantly increased in size and intensity over the past week.
And Payton, my final question. First, there was the wall of moms, then the dads with the leaf blowers, then veterans showed up in sympathy with the Navy man who was beaten and had a broken hand as a result of his nonviolent interaction with these federal officers. Are there any other groups that have joined as a defined contingent?
I would say I've been seeing medical health professionals and nurses protesting and marching, but they usually keep their distance once things get really tense. The people in the groups who I see who are shielding other protesters and forming a wall and a line in front of the courthouse fence and facing off with the federal police, that has been consistently people identifying themselves as moms, people identifying themselves as veterans, and the such.
And Payton, as we wrap up, is there any other scene or image that you'd like to share with my listeners that is important to you from the past few days?
I would say there's one that stood out to me, and it's a car that was parked. And what happened was federal police officers were firing tear gas canisters and pushing away protesters. And one of those tear gas canisters, whether intentionally or not, smashed through the back windshield of this parked car in downtown Portland. And the tear gas canister actually lit the back of the car on fire. And so there's a photo of that fire burning in the back of this person's parked car. And that is when things started to get pretty intense, because who knows if that fire was going to reach the gas tank in it. But thankfully, a few protesters who were close by came by and started dumping water into it, and they were able to put out the fire.
Mm-hmm. Payton, thank you for your eyewitness account. I really appreciate it, and thanks for being our witness on the scene in Portland.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
As mentioned, Payton Bruni is a recent graduate of the journalism school at the University of Oregon in Eugene and has been on the streets of Portland for several weeks now to cover the conflict that has been heightened by the insertion of federal agents. And one of the things that I referred to in the interview is a kind of odd court ruling that came from a federal judge in a case that was brought by the Attorney General of Oregon, whose name is Ellen Rosenblum. And Rosenblum sued, asking for an injunction, saying that federal officers were violating the law and that they should be ordered to clearly identify themselves when seizing protesters, and they must end making arrests without probable cause. But District Court Judge Michael Mossman, who was appointed by George W. Bush years ago, rejected the motion, arguing that she didn't present enough evidence that future harm would continue at the hands of these agents. And the judge raised doubts about whether the state had legal standing to pursue a suit on behalf of protesters or others. And I find that to be a head-in-the-sand approach from the judge. A separate court had ruled, as we also reference in the conversation with Payton Bruni, that reporters and legal observers must be given deference by these federal goons. And as you heard Payton Bruni explain, that appears to be happening. Whether or not it's a result of the judge's order it's guesswork at this point. And it is notable that these scenes are playing out in what is described as the whitest big city in America. Less than 6% of the population is African American, and that has led to some tensions and bad feelings that black leaders have, that whites have overtaken their protest, that the violent elements are, not conforming to the wishes of black leaders. And while I can understand that, to me, this very strong and consistent response from a primarily white group of protesters, I think, shows the depth of the support for Black Lives Matters. And when we see the moms, the veterans, the dads with leaf blowers, and now nurses and other medical professionals, again, predominantly white, I think it's an important statement. In an article at The Guardian today, we learn a little bit about the internal thinking of members of Customs and Border Protection. They are among federal marshals, Federal Protective Services, and the SWAT team from the Department of Homeland Security, who are the mix of these armed goons on the streets of Portland today. And they quote a man named James Tomshek, who was once a top internal affairs investigator at CBP, and he describes a meeting going back to January of 2011. And he said that the vibe in the hotel ballroom where this conference was held showed that the people who run Customs and Border Protection, and this is during the Obama years, get that context, had a very militarized vision for this agency. They wanted it to become the Marine Corps of the U.S. federal law enforcement community. And they were told that they're not cops because they're not required to adhere to the same constitutional restraints on the use of force, because they're primarily dealing with people who are not American citizens and who are treated as really second-class humans. So Tomczyk said that he had heard the nightmare scenario described by his bosses almost a decade ago and saw it becoming real on the streets of Portland. He told The Guardian Border Patrol has always seen itself as a militarized force, and that aspiration is now being enabled by the current administration. And a study of the Southern Border Community Coalition found that at least 111 people have died as the result of an encounter with a border agent in the last 10 years. And Tomczyk investigated numerous cases of what he concluded to be inappropriate use of lethal force and resulted in needless deaths along the border. The article also quotes a woman, Jen Budd, who spent 6 years as a senior Border Patrol agent when she blew the whistle on a station chief who himself was smuggling drugs. And in her experience, these border tactical units are among the most violent and racist in all of law enforcement. And she called BORTAC the RoboCops of the U.S. Border Patrol. Here's another quote. They don't exist within the realm of civilian law enforcement. They view people they encounter in the military sense as enemy combatants, meaning they have virtually no rights. And as she's seen the actions in Portland, she said they don't do normal vehicle stops. They will rip drivers from their seat, throw them against the side, put them in handcuffs, the same tactics that you're now seeing agents use in Portland. And the tensions on the streets spread. We'll cover Seattle here in just a moment. But over the weekend, the federal deployment of these armed troops to Portland, it inspired protests in Los Angeles, Omaha, Richmond, Oakland, across the bay from me, where there was some minor vandalism, protesters smashing windows at a courthouse. In Austin, Texas, an armed protester was shot and killed by a motorist who had a weapon in the vehicle. And there were other nonviolent protests that didn't draw any particular media attention. But one of the reasons we can confirm that this is so politicized and that Trump is creating a kind of domestic military theater is that his campaign has now spent more than $26 million on TV ads depicting a lawless dystopia of empty police stations. And I've seen a commercial where an elderly woman is watching TV and hearing about, defund the cops. At the same time, an intruder breaks into her home. So she picks up the phone and calls 911, and as the commercial proceeds, her 911 call goes to an answering machine that says, sorry, but we can't respond because we've been defunded. So this is, it is a concoction. And this is Trump's desperate effort to rally the law and order portion of his base. And he freely stokes it with extra gasoline and doses of racism that make it toxic and unfortunately effective with certain groups in America. So Chicago's Mayor Lori Lightfoot, I fear, has been lulled into a kind of complacency, because after a phone call with Trump, she said she welcomed the president's intervention to Chicago on enacting gun control and investing in community programs. But that's not what he's doing. He has sent officers who are supposed to work on homicide investigations in Chicago. And Lightfoot added, any other form of militarized assistance within our borders that would not be within our control or within the direct command of the Chicago Police Department would spell disaster. But that won't stop him. And as I've ridiculed before, the idea that he can bring in 150 agents and quell the street violence, the drug violence, the gang violence in Chicago, I think is a sick joke. Also, New Mexico, which is also a scene of a modest deployment of Trump's stormtroopers, Democratic Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham called the administration's decision to send law enforcement agents to her state a bit suspect. They have not provided the federal funding that was promised to Albuquerque for police and crime intervention, she said, and that the state would work with federal agents if they folded into existing efforts to address violent crime. But, she said, if we're going to incentivize unrest, then that's something altogether different. Well, the language is softening, if you notice. They're still trying to keep a fence around their rights as a community. But they're no longer speaking in terms of outrage. And my fear is that their police chiefs will undermine the elected officials, and we will see Trump's hand strengthened as more cities become the scene of deployment by federales. In Seattle, Saturday was a difficult day, Sunday more peaceful. And on Saturday, there were skirmishes. There are reports of 59 officers being injured, 45 demonstrators arrested. And when I last left you on Friday, I told you about that letter from Police Chief Carmen Best where she was essentially warning that her officers were not going to do their duty in protests over the weekend because she said they had had their toolbox locked up by the city council. Well, a federal judge intervened late on Friday and essentially voided the local regulation that prevented the use of tear gas and so-called less lethal weapons. Now, from what we know, they didn't use tear gas in Seattle, but they made liberal use of pepper spray, and they seem to be targeting people and targeting their faces more than they have in the past. And so this is a very uncomfortable situation where we have federal bigfooting through the courts, through the Trump administration, of the authority of local leaders. And one of the protesters in Seattle, 24-year-old Cass Bunting, was on the receiving end of an explosive device that was tossed by a police officer. I felt an explosion at my feet, and I promptly lost feeling. And she posted a picture on Twitter of bloodied and burned ankles. And with some anger, she said, those kind of instances of brutality brings to the surface the violence of the system and the inequity and the problems that people are protesting, adding that officers were haphazardly tossing things into the crowd. And observers in Seattle for the National Lawyers Guild said Sunday that on Saturday, officers had engaged in the indiscriminate use of pepper spray, blast balls, rubber bullets, flashbang grenades, and specifically targeted legal observers with pepper spray, flashbangs, police bikes, and by needlessly grabbing and shoving them. A video provided by NLG shows an observer in a green hat standing in front of a line of protesters when an officer sprays pepper spray and douses her face. So it was a tense scene. Police did declare it was a riot. And past president of the Seattle chapter, the National Lawyers Guild, is quoted here. We have never experienced the kind of direct, targeted, aggressive violence from law enforcement numerous times in one legal observing engagement, as we did on Saturday. The federal agents sent to Seattle did not appear on the streets over the weekend. And Paul Leto sent us some comments. By the way, his son Jonah, who has been reporting for us, is currently in Minneapolis, and we hope at some point he'll be able to resume his correspondent duties for the Peter B. Collins podcast. And Paul writes, over the weekend it became clear that Seattle dropped its plans to seek to stop its own city council's crowd control ban because the city couldn't sue itself or ask a court to stop itself. Instead, the feds rushed in to do so and got a temporary restraining order, stopping the weapons ban from going into effect. Police also wrote letters to businesses on Friday, announcing that they felt they were unable to protect those business establishments. At 2 p.m. Saturday, demonstrations organized by the Youth Liberation Front ended up breaking windows and burning construction trailers at a new youth jail being built. So by 5 p.m., police had declared a riot wherever protesters happened to be located. Many hundreds were injured. That's protesters. Police claim 59 of their officers were injured in some way. All of the protests, says Leto, were intended to protest and illustrate why police should be defunded. The police actions, like telling businesses they won't be protected, are all apparently designed to create calls for more police and more funding rather than less funding, as demanded by protesters. And going back to the night of Juneteenth, when the Capitol Hill Occupied protest was ongoing, and a man named Horace Anderson, Jr. was shot multiple times. As far as I know, there is still not a suspect in that shooting. But public media, KUOW, which I believe is a public radio and television group, they published a very detailed timeline of the events in the CHOP on Juneteenth. It began at 2:19 a.m. with the sound of gunshots. And what's at issue is that the police chief, Carmen Best, has said that cops wanted to reach the injured man to clear the scene for medics, but they were prevented by protesters. And this detailed timeline, basically contradicts what the police chief has said. There were firefighters with an ambulance who were standing by, but they went to an intersection where the police were not located. And it seems that in some sort of a turf struggle, the police wouldn't come to where the ambulance was, and the ambulance wouldn't go to where the police were. And so they wasted a lot of time while this injured man was being treated by volunteer medics, who ultimately decided that an ambulance wasn't going to come, and so they took this injured man to a local hospital in the back of a pickup truck. And the article details some of the radio calls back and forth between the cops and the ambulance operators. And so to see the police chief continue to try to blame protesters for what was clearly, to be generous about it, a miscommunication between fire and police departments, well, I think it says something about her credibility. Well, we have a whistleblower surfacing in Washington, a National Guard officer, the D.C. National Guard. He's a major. His name is Adam DeMarco. He will be testifying on Capitol Hill tomorrow about the events that occurred at Lafayette Square on the day when Trump addressed the media in the Rose Garden, and then he strolled across the street to St. John's Church where he posed with a Bible. But while Trump was addressing the media, Bill Barr, his attorney general, had been outside, essentially ordering and some of these unnamed military-looking officers, like the ones we see in Portland, who were by that time on the streets of Washington, D.C., they cleared the area so Trump could come through. And Major DeMarco is offering an account that contradicts with the claims of Bill Barr And in particular, DeMarco says that excessive force was used against nonviolent protesters who were demonstrating there at Lafayette Square. So he will be testifying Tuesday before the House Natural Resources Committee, and it'll be very interesting to see, in particular, how Republicans respond to his testimony. Well, this didn't occur to me. Who's behind the funding for a lot of these pro-police organizations that block efforts at reform and that prevent officers from being properly held accountable for brutality and other crimes committed in uniform? Well, The Guardian reports that big corporations accused of driving environmental and health inequalities in black and brown communities across the country are also funding powerful police groups in major U.S. cities. Some of America's largest oil and gas companies, private utilities, financial institutions bankroll fossil fuels also back these police foundations. And they give examples. Chevron, a multinational oil and gas company among the world's top 25 polluters, owns 2 of the worst 6 benzene-emitting refineries. Chevron is a corporate sponsor of the New Orleans Police and Justice Foundation, and a board member of the Houston Police Foundation, sponsor of the Houston Mounted Patrol, donating and serving on the board of the Salt Lake City Police Foundation. Then there's Shell, which is nominally a British company, one of the biggest fossil fuel companies in the world, now building a huge ethane cracker near Pittsburgh. They're a featured partner of the New Orleans Police Foundation and a sponsor of Houston Police's Mounted Patrol. And Marathon Petroleum, based in Findlay, Ohio, has long been accused of generating pollution that disproportionately affects the health of black and brown communities. Marathon security coordinator is on the board of the Detroit Police Foundation. I never would have considered that connection. And while we're talking about big oil and big gas, I want to commend The Guardian because at the top of its homepage today, essentially its front page, they are drawing attention once again to the most important situation facing us here on planet Earth, and that's climate change. And they have a series of articles framed around the impact of a second Trump term, because his announced exit from the Paris Climate Accords would take effect one day after our presidential election in November. And as you know, I don't think the Paris Accords are going to fix the problem. But it's a start. It's cooperation on a global level. It does set some important goals. And so I'm not against the Paris Accord. It's simply not enough. So I commend The Guardian for paying attention to the issue that has kind of fallen off the radar because of health and economic crises. I want to thank Joe Carson, longtime listener and supporter of this podcast, for tipping us off, and I want to share this with you. This coming Thursday, July 30th, is National Whistleblower Appreciation Day. And the National Whistleblower Center is hosting a conference, and you are invited. And you don't need to book a hotel room or travel to Washington, D.C., because they're not meeting in person. It is a virtual conference available online for free, and there is a film festival that is a part of the package that is available at a nominal charge. And I've got a link to the organization's website. It's nationalwhistleblowerday.org, and if you don't catch that right here, you can follow the link in the show file at peterbcollins.com for today's podcast. Late on Friday, I had the opportunity to record an in-depth interview with Bill Binney, one of many that I've done over the years with a trusted whistleblower from the National Security Agency, where he once served as the top technical officer. And it's been a while since I talked to Bill, and so I wanted to get an update from him on recent disclosures. Oh, like the testimony of Sean Henry of CrowdStrike that, no, we don't have any evidence that anybody was able to exfiltrate information from the DNC servers remotely. Binney also affirms other recent developments. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Bill Binney.
All the DNC emails published by WikiLeaks showed that they were all downloaded to a storage device and then physically transported before WikiLeaks could publish them, and we could prove that by forensics, and also that Guccifer 2 was a fraud, and that the evidence of Guccifer 2 pointed back to CIA as the origin of the Guccifer 2 character, and that the indictments by Rosenstein and all, and Mueller's report, all of that was a fabrication of fake. And, it was just a general crucifying all of the things that they drugged this entire nation through for the last 3.5 years.
You can hear the full interview with Bill Binney. It's available right now for all my subscribers at peterbcollins.com, TuneIn, iTunes, Spreaker, and Stitcher. And Binney believes that we are going to see exposure of the so-called Obamagate conspiracy as Russiagate continues to unravel. And Bill Barr, of course, who is working on that project, is also working on the extradition of Julian Assange from London. There was a hearing held earlier today featuring an attorney for Assange named Edward Fitzgerald. And he is saying that Bill Barr has made sure that the effort to extradite Assange is, it's aimed at political ends, he says. There's a discussion of the new indictment that superseded the original indictment. And the biased judge in the case, Vanessa Baratzer, told the hearing the deadline had arrived for any further evidence before the extradition hearing. She said she expected all parties to attend the hearing in September in person. And over the weekend, Trump was tweeting more about Obamagate, and he didn't mention the fake news New York Times. It's one of his favorite targets, and of course, they have committed yellow journalism, in my view, in so many respects related to the Russiagate narrative. And the latest is that the FBI has disclosed indirectly, but it's been confirmed, the name of a Russian-American. His name is Igor Danchenko, who is described as a subsource, a contributor to Christopher Steele's dossier, which was opposition research paid for at that time by the law firm for Hillary Clinton's campaign and the Democratic National Committee. And I've long ago felt the Steele dossier was not credible, especially the idea that Trump hired hookers to pee on a bed at the Ritz in Moscow. But Danchenko, who is a guy who researches business and technology data, it's not really clear why he was tapped by Christopher Steele to contribute information to the opposition research project. And in January of 2017, the FBI identified Danchenko, who soon agreed to answer investigators' questions in exchange for immunity, which has now evaporated. And the New York Times, in this report, claims falsely the Steele dossier played no role in the FBI's opening of the Russia investigation in July 2016, and Mr. Mueller did not rely on it for his report. But it was certainly one of the elements that produced the opening of the case called Crossfire Hurricane. And toward the end of this article, the Times concedes the dossier did play an important role in a narrow part of the FBI's early Russia investigation, the wiretapping of Carter Page. And I think it's going to be a long time before the New York Times admits the serious errors that it made in its Russiagate investigation. Susan Rice is running for vice president. It's very clear. She's been all over the TV news programs being interviewed. And as I have refrained from a lot of speculation about who Biden's going to pick as his VP, she does seem to be an attractive candidate. And the New York Times reveals that she toyed with moving to Maine, where she has a summer home, and running against Susan Collins this year, but she ultimately decided not to. And I've met Susan Rice. I interviewed her at the Obama coronation, the Democratic National Convention in Denver in 2008. I found her to be extremely capable, very intelligent. She had a bit of a sense of humor in our exchange. But I would rule her out based on two words: Syria, Libya. Tom Cotton, the Neanderthal senator from Arkansas, gave a speech where he is denouncing the New York Times for its 1619 Project. That was the series of articles noting that that's when slaves arrived on these shores. And Tom Cotton thinks that's a false history. So he's written the Saving American History Act of 2020 to prohibit the use of federal funds to teach the 1619 Project in schools. And he told a newspaper in Arkansas the entire premise of the New York Times' factually, historically flawed 1619 Project is that America is at root a systemically racist country to the core and irredeemable. Well, I think the first part is correct. The irredeemable part, I'm not so sure. But then he said this: I reject that root and branch. America is a great and noble country founded on the proposition that all mankind is created equal. We've always struggled to live up to that promise, but no country has ever done more to achieve it. We have to study the history of slavery and its role and impact on the development of our country, because otherwise we can't understand our country. As the Founding Fathers said, it was the necessary evil upon which the Union was built, but the Union was built in a way, as Lincoln said, to put slavery on the course to its ultimate extinction. Wow. That is a fascinating form of historical revisionism that seems just plain tone deaf in today's sensitive racial environment. Here's today's COVID-19 update prepared by Linda Lewis. Globally, the worldwide confirmed caseload is at 16.2 million with 649,000 reported deaths. The U.S. total confirmed cases is 4.25 million. Total deaths now at nearly 147,000. She opens with a story of Dr. Fauci appearing in Georgia, saying today that a vaccine approval is likely in November, while an October vaccine approval is conceivable. But Linda says, before you get your hopes up, read the Atlantic's COVID-19 reality check, describing administration projections of an October vaccine as exceedingly rosy. Quote, biologically, a vaccine against COVID-19 virus is unlikely to offer complete protection. Logistically, manufacturers will have to make hundreds of millions of doses while relying perhaps on technology never before used in vaccines and competing for basic supplies like glass vials. Then the federal government will have to allocate doses, perhaps through a patchwork of state and local health departments, which has led vaccine distribution efforts. The CDC has led these efforts in the past, and it's been strikingly absent in discussions so far. To complicate it all, 20% of Americans already say they'll refuse to get a COVID-19 vaccine, with another 31% unsure. And reaching herd immunity could be that much more difficult. The FDA's guidelines for a vaccine recognize it may be far from 100% effective. To win approval, the agency says a vaccine should prevent or reduce severe disease in at least 50% of people who get it. And as you know, I find myself quite skeptical that a vaccine will be available this soon, that it will probably, properly be tested for efficacy and, more importantly, for safety. and that the fundamental claim that this coronavirus produces antibodies that are short-lived raises questions about the viability of any vaccine. And then Linda goes to Politico, which throws more cold water on hopes for October. There's virtually no chance the U.S. will have a proven vaccine by Election Day, several top vaccine experts told Politico. Quote, while the Trump administration has insisted that it won't cut corners on safety, a vow the vaccine developers have taken as well, it's left the door open to short-circuiting the process before those trials are complete. The result could be a major milestone in the pandemic's trajectory days before an election that has evolved into a referendum on Trump's management of the spiraling crisis. It could also jump the gun on the scientific process, undermining public confidence in any eventual vaccine and raising the risk that the initial round of shots won't work or will lead to unpredictable side effects. Speaking of which, writes Linda, experts are warning that COVID-19 vaccines may be reactogenic, meaning that some of those who receive them in clinical trials experience discomfort such as headache, sore arms, fatigue, chills, and fever. And here's a quote from Catherine Edwards, scientific director of the Vanderbilt Vaccine Research Program. I think one of the things we're going to have to realize is that all of these vaccines are going to be reactogenic. At least two manufacturers, Cambridge, Massachusetts-based Moderna and CanSino, a Chinese vaccine maker, stopped testing the highest doses of their COVID-19 vaccines because of the number of severe adverse events recorded among participants in their clinical trials. The side effects are being seen across a number of different vaccines made in different ways. And so we're going to see how all this develops, but I have to call Dr. Fauci's reports today a kind of premature ejaculation. The Florida Department of Health reports that COVID-19 infections in Florida's children increased 34%, hospitalizations 23%, between just July 16th and 24th. 36% of the cases in children are patients between the ages of 14 and 17, and that age group also accounts for the majority of children hospitalized. Wow. Trump's national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, age 54, has tested positive for COVID-19. He caught the virus while spending time with his family, possibly from his daughter, who fell ill first. Several National Security Council members told CBS News they didn't know anything about O'Brien's diagnosis prior to being contacted by the media. O'Brien was on White House grounds last Thursday, raising questions about potential exposure. It's also reported that White House staffers only learned of his test via press reports. O'Brien recently returned from a trip to Europe where he was photographed without wearing a mask or social distancing with several foreign leaders. And here's a quote from Mark Knoller of CBS. President Trump is unable to say when he last saw Robert O'Brien. I haven't seen him lately, said the president during a brief Q&A before departing the White House on his chopper. The New York Times reports that FEMA has been sending defective medical gear to nursing homes. The supplies include expired surgical masks, masks with brittle elastic bands that break when they're stretched, extra small gloves that are all but useless for the typical health worker's hands, loose gloves stuffed into Ziploc bags with no identified origin. No functional N95 respirator masks were included. FEMA has been shipping the supplies since spring to 15,000 nonprofit nursing care facilities with limited finances. In a statement, FEMA said it had addressed the complaints about the first shipment of goods and had asked the private contractor providing the supplies to replace the tarp-like gowns they had sent with models more familiar to medical personnel. The Daily Beast cites a Washington Post report revealing that Donald Trump's senior advisors have begun presenting coronavirus data to the president in terms of which electorally important states could be most affected. by the virus next, and where GOP-leaning areas were being significantly affected in order to sway him into taking stronger action on the virus. In recent weeks, White House advisors have been presenting Trump with maps and data showing spikes in cases among our people. Yeah, they're the ones you got to preserve, at least until November, right? This new messaging seems to have worked, according to advisors. It's fair to say he has gotten more serious about dealing with the crisis, primarily because he sees it threatening his political viability. In an op-ed for CNN, the former president of ABC News, Ben Sherwood, notes that only 34% of Americans put a great deal or good amount of trust in what Trump says about the virus. 64% trust him only a little or not at all. And he writes, trust in government, academia, science, media, tech, organized religion, even our fellow citizens, has been declining for years, propelled downhill by a systematic campaign to break it down and technology that rewards immediacy over accuracy and negativity over nuance. Wherever you stand politically, this should be a matter of great concern, he says. Trust is crucial to our survival. In its own way, it's as important as wearing masks. According to a new report, there are about 4,000 federal employees seeking disability compensation on the grounds that they contracted the coronavirus at work, while survivors of 60 deceased employees are seeking death benefits. And this affects Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, Veterans Affairs, and, of course, the Pentagon, where of the civilian employees, about 750,000, 257 are currently hospitalized, and 32 have died. While in the uniformed military, there have been 3 deaths among 24,000 cases. And the struggling over the next bailout bill continues in Washington. Republicans seem intent on reducing the unemployment federal boost from $600 to $200 a week. And as I've been ranting about for days, they remain oblivious about the risk to the whole rental home industry, both the renters who will be evicted and the landlords who will be stuck with vacant units and significant losses. Also, the Republicans are trying to split off the renewal of unemployment benefits, even if they're modified, from the other parts of the package. And that would seriously undermine Nancy Pelosi's leverage, and she clearly is resisting that. I want to thank our friend in Switzerland, listener and subscriber, Olivier de Merlot, who sent me a long and loving letter, which included compliments and criticism. He complimented me for the latest interview with Bill Binney and my general approach of skepticism to Russiagate. He also complimented me. He said, "You've avoided the tribal allegiance to the favorite choice of the external enemy. You also have refused to take the government's description of what happened at 9/11 at face value, which, says Olivier, in my book, is something to praise you for." And then to the criticism part. And I welcome criticism. I'm not sensitive about this. He makes a pretty strong argument that I am kind of captive to what he calls the democratic tribal way. And I've been filtering out what Olivier thinks is legitimate information that goes against the views that I seem to support. And he has in the past sent me information that I have reviewed. And he has a pretty long list here of topics that he feels I've been a little bit weak on. Now, I have talked about the origin and genesis of the virus, whether it came from a lab or not. He writes the difference between dying of and dying with the virus. And, I've made a broad statement that the data that we have are so unreliable, and the definition of what is a COVID death and, what is something that was related to COVID or people who died of other causes while going through an infection. And he also raises questions. I have talked about antibody tests just a couple of minutes ago. So I take your points. I think I have discussed many of these issues, perhaps or likely, not in a way that Olivier finds satisfying. But let me quote a couple of items here. He says, if you listen to immunologists, they'll tell you that the immune system has many layers, that there is a so-called innate immune system which is strongest in children, which immediately takes care of the virus, and which is the reason they don't get sick. And while I haven't talked about that in detail, Olivier, I have alluded to it, and my concern, for example, about reopening schools is not that the children will infect each other so much, is that they will be asymptomatic carriers of the virus and they can take it home. And I consider these to be largely unknown factors, but the experience that we have cited in Israel gives me great pause about experimenting on American school children. Here's another quote from Olivier. Various epidemiologists will tell you that models used to describe epidemics are only suitable for analysis after the fact and are not suitable for predicting the evolution of an epidemic that has just started. And I fully agree with you there, Olivier, and this is one of the reasons that I have been a little reluctant to embrace challenges to the, general narrative. And the other thing is that I'm not a scientist. And so I do take care not to stick my neck out beyond my own knowledge and sensibilities. And so if I am cautious, if I am careful about really signing on to alternate theories, I think that is largely the explanation. And Olivier wrote more, but I don't really have time for it. I thank you for the love and the information, Monsieur de Mirlot. Also, I am going to announce today that I'm making the final grant from the Peter B. Collins Community Fund. I have given away all of the money that came from listeners, from subscription revenue, and from donations that I made to the fund. But I'm very touched by this note from Quebec, from Martin Bilodeau, who's had a series of medical setbacks that have made it impossible for him to work, and he is running out of cash. So $100, and it's American dollars, Martin. We'll make sure we get it to you. And I thank you for being a listener and for requesting a grant. And finally today, a couple of quick items. Israeli security forces say they exchanged fire with a Hezbollah cell to turn back an attempted incursion at the border with Lebanon today. But Hezbollah, which usually does admit to its actions, has declined to accept responsibility, and in fact, they have denied it. A nonprofit organization that provides for the well-being of soldiers of the Israeli Defense Forces, an American-based nonprofit, the Friends of Israeli Defense Forces, they received $2.5 million in a forgivable PPP loan from the Small Business Administration. There are more details in the article at Mint Press News. And finally, not a moment too soon, Ken Marcus is leaving his job at the Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, where he has been perverting the intention of that office to promote his strong Zionist agenda. And even the New York Times describes him as a fierce champion for Israel, a critic of anti-Zionist movements on college campuses. And he singled out Rutgers University and has used that as a cudgel to try to limit free speech, particularly that is critical of the state of Israel, by calling it all anti-Semitic. Bye-bye, Ken. I don't think we're going to miss you. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.